Good evening. Gail told me this is informal, so I'm wearing the Stockton sweatshirt she bought me when I learned that it's wintertime in the buildings and summertime outside. So I'm a little cool. I don't know. I came to New Jersey in the summertime. I grew up in North Jersey, by the way, and I made Aliyah to Israel 39 years ago. And I remember Israel as being hot and muggy all summer, and I guess we didn't have as much air conditioning when I was a kid. So anyway, I want to thank Gail, and I want to thank Stockton for inviting me to be here the last 2 days. It was a really fascinating experience for me. We work with teachers from around the world at Yad Vashem, but it's something else working with them in situ, in their place, and to hear them, and to hear their concerns and the things that are important to them and what they want to know. And I enjoyed that very much. And again, when you educate educators about the Holocaust, we're trying to teach them the things that we've learned over the years, but it's a dialogue, because you have to hear from them all the time. And I'm not the pedagogue. My colleague Shani, who was with me, is the pedagogue. I'm the content person. But Shani and I work together on many things at Yad Vashem, and having some understanding of what the educators want and need, for me, that was very important. And in addition to that, by inviting me to come here for 2 days, I made a whole big trip out of it. My wife joined me. My kids are going to join me. Huh? Can you not hear in this? Oh, the POC, I didn't turn you on. So you're not recording me yet. That's okay. No, we're not going to start again. Okay. But anyway, I managed to make a big trip out of it, which is also nice, and I'm going to have some vacation. I want to talk to you about something, and I'm going to start by reading you a quote. And it's not an easy quote, because our subject's never an easy subject. This quote comes from a book by a colleague, and again, what happens to most of us when we're dealing with the subject long enough, the colleagues become our very close friends. And this is my close friend, Jan Grabowski, Professor Jan Grabowski from the University of Ottawa. And he wrote a book called The Hunt for the Jews. And it's a paragraph I'm going to read. In May 1944, in Sutkov, near Radogast, members of the local night watch arrested 18-year-old Chaim Kni. One of the peasants called to the commander on the watch, "Francis, we've got ourselves a little Jew." Kni, known to the locals simply as Little Chaim, begged for mercy, to no avail. Sometime later, the commander of the Sutkov watch, testified that when Chaim saw me, he said, "What did I do to them? Why did they tie me up like this?" Then Chaim sat on a bench and started to pray. I want to add that everybody knew Chaim well, because he had stayed in our area from the beginning of the war. Soon, the victim, with hands tied with barbed wire behind his back, was delivered to the Radogast police station, where he was murdered the same day. My professor Jan Grabowski was recently attacked in print by an organization, an NGO in Poland, who is very interested in defending the honor of the Polish people. And these people, along with many others in Poland, believe that a paragraph like this is attacking the honor of the Polish people. In a sense, there's something that we could call a battle for the memory of the Holocaust going on. I think that for survivors, in the first years after the Holocaust, in some ways they would be amazed that here we are in 2017 still talking about it. And some of them would be amazed at all of the things that have happened. And Yad Vashem has 170 million pages of documents and 163,000 publications and so much material. And other places have similar collections, maybe smaller, but very important collections, right? In some ways, that's the amazing part. But what is disturbing so much is that in recent years, what's going on is really a battle for memory. There are people out there who are so involved in trying to manipulate this memory or to diminish it or to take it in all kinds of directions. And the idea that if you talk about the Holocaust very clearly and talk about it straightforwardly in countries where it happened, and when you talk about and discuss what the locals' role was in the Holocaust, not meaning that all the locals in all kinds of countries in Europe were always the perpetrators and that all of them were doing these things, but that some of them were, and significant parts of the population often were. that in some way that's hurting the honor of the people of the nation because you're trying to discuss the history. And this is part of what's going on today. It's very much an element of what we could call this battle for the memory of the Holocaust. The battle of the memory of the Holocaust is not just going on in Poland, of course. In Hungary, we have similar things. I don't know how much you follow what goes on in these parts of Europe, but unfortunately, I find myself following them not a little bit. And for quite a while now in Hungary, if you write an article that's deemed in some way to hurt the honor of the Hungarian nation, you will not be prosecuted, but the journal in which you published it will be prosecuted. So that means that the editors of the journals are very careful about what they're doing because they don't want their journal to be prosecuted. They don't want to lose, whatever they have. That's their livelihood, obviously. So this idea that, again, this open discussion in some way hurts the honor of the people, that's part of what's going on out there. It's not the only thing. We can also talk about attempts to shift the story or deduct responsibility for what's going on. Shifting them, you can see it in so many ways. And I deal a lot with Hungary. That's really the subject of some of my writings. And my dissertation dealt with Hungary and Slovakia once upon a time. So I've always been involved in it. And in Hungary, I can tell you about a couple of things that have happened where you can see this attempt to shift responsibility or to shift the story in such a way. One of the things that happened not too long ago, I guess it's about 2 years ago now, that a monument was put up in Budapest to all of the victims of the German occupation. Hungary's got a complicated story. They were an ally of Germany, and in 1943, fighting in Stalingrad on that front, where there's a giant battle of the Stalingrad battle, the Hungarians were also on that front. When the Axis, the German forces, along with the Hungarians, Romanians, Italians that were all on that front, were defeated in February of 1943, Hungary began looking for a way to get out of its alliance with Germany. That's what they were trying to do. And then the Germans knew about this as it was happening, and by late 1943, it was disturbing them a great deal because they needed the Hungarians in the war effort because it's men and material. I mean, it's food. It's all kinds of things they're getting from them. And finally, on March 19th, 1944, the Germans occupied their ally. And that's when the Holocaust in Hungary really went into full gear. And then the Germans are in Hungary, and then in the end of the year, the Soviets are fighting, and they've pushed into Hungary, and they've encircled Budapest on Christmas Eve of 1944, and then Budapest falls in January and February in two pieces, because there's two parts of the city, two sides of the river. Okay. During that period, there's a lot of death. And it's in that period that the Jews are deported, and the Jews of Hungary are deported en masse, mostly to Auschwitz. And then there's a stop, and then that happens in the spring, and then in the autumn, more Jews are deported towards the Austrian border in order to build fortifications. So the Jews are suffering horribly in Hungary, and most of the death of Jews, and about 60% of the Jews of Hungary died in the Holocaust. That's happening mostly in that period. That's what we can be talking about. And then there's the fighting for Hungary, in which many Hungarians are falling as well, okay, during the fighting and until Hungary falls. And then after it falls, the situation's not very good, not a lot of food, and the Soviets are not so nice to people. There's more death. So the Hungarians put up a monument to all the people who fell. And okay, and you say, well, look at there, we're all Hungarians, they all fell. But there's a tremendous difference between the Jews who were being deported to their deaths or who were being worked to death to build fortifications, and the Hungarians who had been on the side of the Germans and then were being conquered by the people they were fighting against. That's a little bit different if you ask me, but you have to add something else to it. Who was deporting the Jews to their deaths in Hungary? It was the Hungarian gendarmes and the Hungarian Interior Ministry. There were very few Germans sitting in Hungary deporting them. There was Eichmann, Adolf Eichmann, the infamous Eichmann with a commando there, but they were very small. And the people carrying out the deportations were the Hungarians. So then you put up a monument that says, hey, we're all equal victims. But we're not. They're not equal victims. And that's a distortion of what's going on. And so that's one thing that happened in Hungary. Another thing that happened is until very recently, they were planning on building a museum of the Holocaust in Hungary, in Budapest. They already have a museum of the Holocaust in Budapest, which actually is quite a good museum. But they wanted to build another one because the government didn't like it so much, because the one that was already standing tried to really talk about Hungarian responsibility, among other things. And they wanted to build something they were going to call the House of Fates, and which was about children, Jewish children in Hungary. And what they were trying to say was it was their fate to be deported. Again, not that we deported them, it was their fate. And so they were putting a spin on it. They wanted to teach about Hungarian Jewish children who were being murdered in the Holocaust. But again, moving it to their responsibilities, not there. And the last thing is, maybe you followed the news lately, the Prime Minister of Hungary is a man named Viktor Orban. And when the Prime Minister of Israel was in Hungary, because again, we have relations with them on many levels, he was there just last week, and Viktor Orban said, well, the Hungarians had failed in the Holocaust years because they did not protect their Jewish neighbors, which is a true statement. But he didn't add, the failure is not just that they didn't protect them, the failure was that they had an active role, or a large part of the society had an active role in the deportation and then, the ensuing murder of their neighbors. And so it's not that they just didn't protect them, there's more to it than that. So you give a half of the story and you try to spin. And that's the fight for memory. That's the kind of thing that's going on in Hungary and other places. Another part of the fight for memory is that I often call it the search for the usable past. It's not my title. There's a book by that title, but it's not talking about this particularly. But what happened is that in the post-communist countries, after communism fell, there was a search for a past that they could relate to before the Soviet period, or people who struggled against the Soviet period, looking for heroes. So the people that were being put forth as the heroes, again, were very strongly anti-Soviet. That was part of what was going on. So who were some of the people you would hear that were being put forth? In the Ukraine, a man named Stefan Bandera. Now, Stefan Bandera was a great Ukrainian patriot, but the people working along with him were very involved in, among other things, murdering their Jewish neighbors during Holocaust years. Or you could talk about in Slovakia. Slovakia was independent during World War II, sort of. It was a client state of the Germans. Then it was reconstituted into the reconstituted Czechoslovakia after World War II. And then with the fall of the communist world, the Czech Republic and Slovakia split. So for the Slovaks, there was a sense, this heyday when they were independent in World War II, because they were independent. And some Slovaks put forth as their hero, the person to be adulated, the man who was the head of that independent Slovak Republic during World War II. His name is Father Joseph Tiso, a Catholic priest. He was the head of Slovakia. But it's under Tiso, with the very, very, very strong cooperation of his government, again, that the Jews were deported and murdered from Slovakia. So in a sense, you can say, okay, he's the hero. He was the leader of our last independent state. But in order to do that, you have to not pay attention to what his responsibility was as the head of the state for the murder of the Jews from Slovakia. And again, we can go on and on. The last one I'll mention you is a man named Herbert Cukurs. He was a Latvian. And he's a very romantic figure in Latvia. He was a pilot, in the between the war period when flying airplanes was a really big thing, right? And he was a pilot, and he was very debonair and everything. And not too long ago, a musical was made about him, and it was appearing throughout Latvia about Cukurs' life. And that's good. He's a romantic guy, and so he can be our hero, except they forgot a very small detail. The people who murdered most of the Jews of Latvia were Latvians, and they were in something called the Arais Commando. A man named Victor Arais commanded them, and they killed the Jews of Latvia. Almost all of them were their responsibility, and his deputy was Herbert Cukurs. So he's romantic, he's a pilot, but it was a mass murder of Jews. And so this is part of the fight for memory that's going on out there, that we're all of us who deal in the subject as historians, all of us are really part of that struggle these days. Even though we think we're dealing only with history and the past, there's a lot of present involved in what we're doing. So in addition to the shifting and ducking of responsibility, there's other things that are going on, and I'll mention just a few more of them. There's a tendency in a number of places in the world today to talk a lot about the righteous among the nations. Yad Vashem's recognized 26,000 righteous among the nations, each and every one of them who risked themselves in order to rescue Jews. Diplomats risked their careers, other people were risking themselves. In some places, There was death sentences for saving Jews, sometimes carried out, sometimes not, but certainly it was a great risk to rescue Jews, right? It's a terrible risk in rescuing Jews. And the righteous are people that we really applaud. If they're much more than that, right? That's how we understand them. But in a number of countries today, all they want to do is talk about their righteous. They don't want to talk about the other things that were happening in their society. They don't want to talk about where persecution, again, where locals were involved in persecution in various ways. They don't want to talk about how when the Jews were deported, the locals then took over their homes, legally, illegally, it depends where and how. And then when some Jew happened to survive and come back, his house was taken and he almost never got it back. They don't want to talk about those things. They just want to talk about the righteous. So the righteous are part of the story, but you have to talk about them in a context. And if you don't do that, then that's also a distortion. And that's part of what's going on today. It's frustrating for us at Yad Vashem because we have a big effort. You know, you don't just get to get that award, Righteous Among the Nation, easily. You have to look into it. You have to really be convinced that there's a story there that's true, and a lot of effort's put into it. And it's a very, very important tool educationally to talk about these people who bucked the trend and why they were doing it. That's all very important. But then suddenly, it's almost a boomerang because of the way others are using it and manipulating it, again, in order to distort the story, in order to protect themselves, as it were, to protect the national honor, and the other things I was saying. The last thing I want to talk about is a slightly different issue. In a way, it's even a little older than what I've just been saying. It's mostly known by those of us who deal with it as the double genocide theory. What's the double genocide theory? Well, of course, the Holocaust is a genocide, so that's one of the genocides. The other genocide is Stalin's Crimes, which I'm not a scholar of genocide per se, which you could argue could be genocide, or maybe there's another category of crime they fit in. There are certainly horrific crimes were committed by Stalin, right? We all know that. What's happened, again, especially in the post-communist countries, is that they convinced the European Parliament to set aside a day, the 23rd of August. Why the 23rd of August? That's the day in which a special pact was signed between Germany and the Soviet Union, Stalin, the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, right? Which allowed the Germans to invade Poland on September 1st, 1939, unopposed by the Soviets. In return, the Soviets had their sphere of influence and more. They basically took over the Baltics and half of Poland as an reward for not having opposed the Germans when they invaded Poland. So the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact is about Nazis and about Soviets, right? So that happened on August 23rd, 1939, and that's the day they chosen to commemorate this double genocide. So what they're doing is, again, trying to say that there's the Holocaust and what Stalin's crimes are the same things, or so similar that we should talk about them together. Of course, Stalin's crimes are serious crimes, and nobody would argue, I don't think, that we should forget about them, not know about them, not study them, not commemorate things that should be commemorated, to the victims and everything. That's perfectly legitimate. But they're not the Holocaust. They're a different thing that's going on. First of all, just as an idea, they're different. The Holocaust has its own background. Stalin's crimes has its own background. The Jews are being murdered for reasons, and Stalin's murdering all kinds of people for other reasons. They're not really the same. They're happening more or less in the same period, in the same area. That's true, but they're very different. But the real problem with this double genocide idea, the biggest problem is sort of the subtext to it all. And the subtext is the following. We, in these post-communist countries, we, the local people, we recognize that we had a certain role in the murder of our Jewish neighbors. Of course, maybe a smaller role than we really think they had, but they recognize some of it, right? So they take a certain amount of responsibility. But then they would add, during the Soviet regime with us, we suffered a great deal under Stalin. And then underneath that, the subtext is that Stalin's crimes are really Jewish crimes, because the conflation of communism And Jews is a very deeply held idea in much of Europe, in much of Eastern Europe, certainly from the time of the Bolshevik or Russian Revolution onward. And it's an idea that's very deeply rooted. So sort of what they're saying, and it's not really sort, it's really what the subtext is that, well, we had a hand in murdering our Jewish neighbors, but look what the Jews did to us. So it doesn't look so bad when you're first talking about, oh, there's two horrible things that happened in the same places around the same time. But when you understand the subtext to it, then you see we have a battle for memory going on. So when I took up the study of the Holocaust, it's now, well, I was 21 and I'm 61, so it's a long time. I wanted to understand the subject, and I wanted to delve into history, and like many of my peers, I wanted to understand my own family history, which is tied up into it, and certainly my national history, and I wanted to understand about human beings and why they do such things. And I thought I was going to be dealing in history. And I never thought that I would be where I am today, dealing so much with this battle for this memory that's going on. If it was mentioned that I write op-eds, lots of my op-eds are about these issues, because that's what's going on. So that's what I wanted to tell you about a little bit. We go back to the education. The only real way we're going to win the battle for history, or battle of memory, is by good education. We need that everywhere. The more people know, the less they might buy into these ideas that are being floated and the distortions and say, well, the distortions are right. The more we can teach them. By the way, it's why I think, and it's the right thing, even though personally, I don't really like what Hungary's government's doing in some of these things. We have official agreements with Hungary's government about teaching about the Holocaust, and that's very important for Yad Vashem. We have a finger in there, or a foot, or a hand, or whatever you want to say, and to continue working with people, good people in Hungary, that want to approach the subject objectively and understand it and teach it to children. That's very important. And so the education, really, that's the key. So we go back to what we're doing with the teachers here. There's other issues in America, perhaps, but anything that we're going to talk about with the Holocaust, and anything somebody wants to use it in any way, the first thing you have to do is know about it, so you understand what's going on. How are they using it? What are they trying to do with it? Is it reasonable? Is it not reasonable? And it could be that I think something's unreasonable and you think it's reasonable, and we disagree. But if you know what you're talking about and I know what I'm talking about, at least we're there. We just might have a disagreement. That's okay. But it's the manipulation that's the problem. And the manipulation really can work the most when people don't know better. And so the education is a key to what we're doing here, the deep key, in addition to the other kinds of things that are going on. Okay, that's what I wanted to say. You asked me to speak not too long. And then, and then we wanted to open up. I mean, I don't know if something I said will have you a question, if there's something else you would like to ask, but I'm here, yeah.
I think it was 14, a couple of years ago, I went on a study tour with Stockton, and Michael Barenbaum was with us. And one evening, Michael brought with a friend of his to dinner, and his name was David Katz.
Yes, I know David. I mean, I don't know him personally, but I've corresponded with him, and I know who he is, yeah.
So, of course, you know, he was looking at all the different monuments that were put up, you know, under communism, like Dinar, and he's saying that these monuments are not correct. And he's working very hard to
correct them.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, I didn't go into some of the deeper roots. One of the reasons also we have some of this going on in the post-communist world is because throughout the communist period, the Holocaust was almost not addressed at all. And when it was addressed in such ways that were very, very inaccurate. I mean, the basic way they saw it was that they were the anti-fascists fighting the fascists, and the people who were killed by the fascists were the victims of, they were anti-fascist victims of fascism. The fact that the overwhelming number of these people that were murdered were Jews wasn't the point. They were anti-fascist citizens of who were murdered. And so many of those plaques and things talked about it in that way. And it was that very long period from the end of the war until 1989, 1990, when things started to open up, that people really, there was a lost generation about knowing the history other than what they might have heard, you know, at home or whatever. So yeah, that's very much a part of things. So that's a deeper thing going on there.
Right. Even going back to the first time I visited Auschwitz back in maybe 2000, I think it was, the guy, I was also on a study tour at that time, but the had our own guide. Our guide was constantly correcting the guide at Auschwitz because they were telling the story not from a Jewish perspective. And, you know, as students of the Holocaust, and genocide,
again,
he was trying to say, you know, these people are taught how to be docents at Auschwitz, but not taught from the perspective that a Jew would like to.
well, I think that has changed at Auschwitz, I think. And there's much more of an understanding from Auschwitz, the people that run the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial, and then the guides as well, about the story than there was maybe in 2000 or certainly into the 90s. In the communist regime in Poland, Auschwitz was seen as a site of Polish murder, which it was in the sense that when Auschwitz first began, the first victims were Polish politicals and priests and others. And there were always Poles who were in Auschwitz, non-Jewish Poles in Auschwitz. And many people, especially in the area of Auschwitz, had a personal story, a family story about Auschwitz. And it was a site of their family suffering, and that's very true. That's a very true part of the story. Given the million or so people murdered at Auschwitz, it's a small percentage relatively who are the Poles, but this was the Polish story. And then if you add to that the reluctance to talk about the Jews, you get that. But starting in around the mid-90s, we began working we, Yad Vashem, began working with the people in Auschwitz about trying to teach their guides the history more objectively and trying to teach them what happened. So I mean, a guide still in 2000 might have been from the old school, maybe didn't go on the course, I don't know what, but as time's gone on, they are more sensitive to it, and I think they've improved. But again, that too was a product of that period and the way they understood things. On the other hand, for we Jews to understand, you know, Jews go to Auschwitz to understand that for the Poles it also is a site of destruction and remembrance. That's important, because that's the part we don't learn here, or we don't necessarily learn here. And again, it's still more minor, but it is a part of the story. Yeah. Yeah. Mary, yes, I see you in the back.
We don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I'll explain it. I'll explain Bloodlands. So the question, there's a book called Bloodlands by a professor at Yale named Timothy Snyder, which in terms of a history book was a great bestseller. A lot of people read it. It was written up in the New York Times, a lot of places. It made a lot of waves in the community of people who are interested in history. It went beyond the scholars. It was already a lot of popular reading. And the book talks about an area of Eastern Europe, which he calls the Bloodlands, in which there are Stalin's crimes and the Holocaust and the Nazis' crimes. And the book tries to talk about the geography of the place and the crimes that are going on there, and try to understand different aspects about why those crimes are happening and how they're unfolding and what's happening there. Timothy Snyder's book is not a work that promotes the double genocide theory, I don't think. That's not why I wrote it. But people who believe in that double genocide theory or want to use it can then draw from Bloodlands. I mean, I heard a president of a country, I won't say which one, in an office at Yad Vashem when I was in a meeting with him, who didn't really understand why we wanted them not to cite the 23rd of August as that day of the double remembrance. We were having a discussion about it. His answer was, but I just read Bloodlands and. I mean, that's how he understood it. But that's not why it was written. I don't think it was written for that. I don't think that he's an advocate of anything like that. But it has things that if you want to misuse information in it, or if you read it from a certain perspective, then it supports in some people's minds that idea that these things are all happening, they're all equal. Again, that's not what he writes, but you can misread him easily, unfortunately. Yeah.
Because I don't think you make that clear-cut distinction you're doing there, that it's easy for those to...
Yeah, it's not as clear-cut sometimes. It's true. I mean, I also, as I read the book, I had examples of things. One of the examples he gives that I noticed, and it's not even about Stalin and crimes, it's about different Nazi crimes. He talks about the murder of Jews in Belarusia of today, when they're taken out and they're shot and they're murdered. And then he talks about how during an anti-partisan campaign in 1943, they went into villages in Belarus that they suspected of having partisans or having helped them, and they razed the villages and they killed the people in the villages. And it's true, there's a similarity to what happened to the Jews, because a lot of civilians are being killed, but there's a tremendous difference, right? Because Jews are being killed simply because they're Jews, they're being killed because of Nazi ideology, and so they're being murdered. And the Belarusian peasants that were being killed because there was partisan activity, and they were being suspected of supporting the partisans. They were still innocent, most of them, and it was still horrible, but one of them had something to do with reality, and the other was only about a conception people had. It had nothing to do with reality. And he didn't make that distinction. I remember reading saying, you have to say that there's a difference between, even there's similarities, there's a difference here. Anyway, something, you had another, yeah. Well, this came up in the seminar. We had some discussion about this. And what we were talking about was, of course, that you certainly need to teach the righteous, but you need to teach everything else around it. They have to be in their context. I mean, if we're talking about 26,000 righteous among the nations, the people that have been recognized, and there's probably many thousands more that we don't know about because they and their victims didn't survive, they and the Jews, again, who were trying to help, they didn't succeed, people were killed. I'm sure there's many more and stories that never came out, but we're not talking about millions of them. We're talking about a few tens of thousands maybe, right? So they're a great minority in Europe. And so you have to just, even looking at that, understand that they're a minority. And there's most of it's other things that are going on. People involved are benefiting from murder. We don't talk bystanders, we don't talk about people just standing there and not doing anything, but the society's involved there in some ways, and there's very few that are actively trying to help Jews, right? That's very small. So you have to keep the context. And so again, and there's a problem in education too, because, well, one thing is right. You don't want, especially for younger kids, you don't want to traumatize younger kids. You want to teach this thing in a way that you can say things that are true without causing them trauma, especially if they're younger, 12, 13, 14-year-olds. Maybe when you're talking about the 17 and 18-year-olds, you can be a lot more open about the things you discuss. And so there's a tendency to try to tell the good things. And the best thing is the righteous, right? Rescue, the righteous, maybe armed resistance, and to forget the bad things. But unfortunately, the overwhelming story of the Holocaust is about bad things. And so you're right, it is an issue. And it's an issue that's come up, and it was coming up today a little bit. And for teacher strategies, again, yes, talk about righteous, it's very important, but you just can't only talk about them, you have to give more than that. And it's certainly always age appropriate, right? That's very important.
Share with us what you did with the teachers with Return to Life, because we all have it in front of us.
I don't know if I even have those notes or anything with me, and I would need the book at least. All right, what did I do with them? Okay, this is what I did.
You could have heard a pin drop when you did this with this.
Well, that's because you only gave me 10 minutes for it.
No.
No, I don't have the letters here. The letters aren't in this.
Oh, then in the book.
So I'll use the book. Okay. Talking about improvising, that's life. I told Gail before, for a long time I played tenor saxophone, jazz saxophone. So improvisation's part of life. So also when you're doing teacher seminars, a lot of improvisation, right?
It's on the left.
Yeah, no, I have it. What I did was I read 2 letters, and I'll read them to you. They're not that long. One of them is dated the 1st of April 1944. It's written in Kaunas, or Kovno, which is in Lithuania. It's sent by a man named Hirsch Brick to a family called Leshem in Tel Aviv, on Achada Am Street 120 in Tel Aviv. If anybody knows Tel Aviv, they know where that is. And he writes the following. My dear friends Leshem, I am alive and I am free. After 3 torturous years, I'm back to being a man like all other men. The German bastards have murdered my entire family. Luba and Arik are no longer with me. I still hope to find them. Even if I wanted to make a list of all the names of our mutual friends who have been savagely murdered, no paper could absorb the ink needed for it. I am still too exhausted for such a task. I'll write you all about it in due time. I'm working now and have sufficient food to eat. I'm earning money and able to get just about everything here. Please send me some clothes urgently, if it's not too complicated for you. Send my regards to Chaim Barles, David Shor, Eliyahu Dobkin, Moshe Kleinbaum, Shefer Bilovskis, and all the rest of my friends. I'm eager to hug them all and just cry our hearts out. I kiss you and your children, yours Hirsch. And then another letter.
That's the back page.
Yeah, oh, you do have. Well, mine didn't have. Okay. Another letter. This one is written to my best friends, and it's undated. Hirsch has already written to you about everything, and all that's left for me to do is to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your true friendship. Yes, my dearest, many dreadful years of horrific nightmares have passed since we saw you depart to Eretz Yisrael. It's impossible to relate in a letter all we have endured. Nobody will ever give us back what we have lost. An entire beautiful Jewish world has ceased to exist. You can no longer see in Lithuania a bearded Jew. Gone are our fathers and our mothers who sustained the fine and pure Jewish life upon their shoulders. A Jewish world is forever gone, and nobody in the surrounding world feels any shame. On the contrary, they still hate us, the survivors, for who we are. But enough about us. We are tragedy personified, albeit we are the lucky ones. Our single hope in Eretz is with a new life, its strength, and its enthusiasm. How are your children? Did Miriam get married? And how's the handsome Dudek who resembled the Roman Caesar? Please let us know how they are doing. And you, how is your life coming along? Be well. I hope to properly repay you for your friendship. Your beloved Arik will soon turn 9. He's a fine big boy, but our constant wanderings have had a very negative effect on him. This is another reason why Eretz is my only hope. Stay well and send my regards to Miriam, Dodek, and the rest of the acquaintances, yours, Luba. And then a postscript, I send my warmest wishes, Arik. So these are 2 letters that were written after liberation in Kovno, in Kaunas. And what I did with the teachers was that I asked them, where do you see the pain and anguish of liberation in these letters? And where do you see the return to life? And I think that you can see some of the things here clearly. Again, we won't go through the whole thing with you, but the thing that stands out so strongly in the first letter written by Hirsch, the 2 things that stand out is that the paper couldn't absorb the ink for all the names of his friends and the people close to him who have been murdered. And then he says at the end that he wishes nothing more than to hug his friends and to cry. I think that's the anguish of liberation we can talk about. It's very clearly articulated in that. And also in Luba's letter, where she talks about the destruction of the Jews and how there's not a bearded Jew anywhere in sight. So this is the anguish of liberation we're talking about. But you also see here returns to life. First of all, who are Hirsch and Luba? Well, Hirsch mentions Luba and Arik. This is his wife and his son. And now Luba's come back in the second letter, and she's also writing. So they've come together. They've come back together now. And Hirsch in the first letter talks about how he's working. And he's okay. He's got enough, more or less. He could use some more clothes. And he's waiting. He's hoping to meet the family, and then that's what happens. And Luba talks about her desire, especially for her son, to get to the land of Israel. So you can see that as well. But then what I did was I asked them what's missing in the letters. And there's a lot missing in the letters. Who are these people? Who are they writing to? Who are the Leshems? What is this all about? What happened to them before? What happened to them afterwards? And so the book that we produced, that's what we were trying to figure out, by the way. And it was a fascinating experience trying to go through the databases at Yad Vashem, looking for information on these people, using the internet, using anything we could find in order to flush out the stories here. So in short, I can tell you this, that Luba was a history teacher in Kovno. Her husband, Hirsch, was a lawyer, and he was the head of the Palestine office, meaning that he was involved in helping Jews immigrate from Kovno, from Lithuania, to Palestine before the war. And the people he wrote to, on the bottom, by the way, he gives all these names. Chaim Barles, he was the representative of the Jewish agency sitting in Istanbul during the war, dealing with rescue activities. He was with a few other people, but he was the most senior. Eliyahu Dobkin, who he mentioned here, I'll just mention a few. Eliyahu Dobkin, he was the head of immigration for the Jewish agency. And Moshe Kleinbaum, some of you might have heard of him from a different name. Kleinbaum in German would be a small tree. In Israel, he changed his name to Sneh, which means a bush. And his name was Moshe Sneh, and he was a communist who was in the Knesset for many, many years. So these were his friends. And Hirsch was a very senior Zionist, right? And that's why Luba was talking about wanting to come to Israel. And the Leshems were Zionist activists from Lithuania who managed to get out and go to Palestine in 1940, already in the war, but before these areas were taken, before the Soviet Union was attacked by the Germans. And they were busy trying to help people as much as they could during the war, and then afterwards to come to the land of Israel. And the Leshems' daughter, son, now I'll be confused, married Ben-Gurion's daughter or son. I forget which. Ben-Gurion has a son, almost. So their daughter, or vice versa, I don't remember. But they're the in-laws of Ben-Gurion. So these were very well-placed people, and these are very high-profile people. The other thing I want to say is that we have Luba's testimony at Yad Vashem, in which she tells about how she and Arik were saved, and in the children's action that happened in 1944 in Kovno, how they smuggled Arik out and then found a place for him to stay. But the place they found, the man became a widower, and then he insisted that Luba also join them to take care of Arik, and she was with them. And then they moved them to another place when things got a little hot, to a very simple farmer. And Luba talks in the testimony about how that farmer was such a gentle soul and a nice man. He would take Arik riding on the horse. And when Luba was feeling very down and very alone and very scared, he would comfort her by saying, Luba, don't worry, one day Arik is going to become a great man. This family then, after the war, went to Italy, and they helped Jews come to the land of Israel from Italy, all the while trying to go there themselves. Finally, in 1947, they came to Palestine. They changed their name from Brick to Barak, and they continued in their work. And their son Arik, or Aaron, grew up, and he became a lawyer and then a judge, and he became Aaron Barak, the head of the Israeli Supreme Court. So that's what you learn, right? The stories. And we were talking about the agony of liberation, the return to life, that the agony is there first, but then there's also the beginnings of the return to life, and people then do return to life. And then the story that unfolds where the little boy Arik, the 9-year-old boy, was having a hard time after liberation, becomes one of the most famous justices or legal minds in the world. Okay, that's what we did.